The day had begun like any other, with the biting chill of early winter creeping into the edges of Kenneth's house, slipping under the doors and through the old window seals James hadn't gotten around to fixing yet. At 57, he had learned to live with discomfort. Years of crawling through industrial conduit systems, unpaid overtime, rewiring factory floors, and the slow erosion of his lower back had taught him that life didn't wait for anyone to catch up. But nothing could have prepared him for the note taped to his bedroom door at 5:30 in the morning. The handwriting was Kenneth's, hasty and cramped. "We need to talk. Serious. Kenneth." James stood in the hallway holding his first cup of instant coffee, staring at those 7 words until the steam stopped rising from the mug. In the bathroom mirror moments earlier, he'd counted the new gray threading through what was left of his hair, the deeper lines around eyes that had spent 3 decades squinting at circuit diagrams under fluorescent lights. The face looking back belonged to someone who'd worked 40-hour weeks since he was 22 and had precious little to show for it, except a storage unit full of tools and a monthly disability check that barely covered phone service. 6 months had passed since he'd moved into Kenneth's spare bedroom. 6 months since he'd sold the house he and Margaret had bought in 1992, the one with the crooked porch steps he'd never fixed, and the kitchen where she'd died slowly over 18 months of experimental treatments that insurance categorized as non-essential. $47,000. That's what hope had cost, drained from savings he'd built penny by penny, overtime shift by overtime shift. Every cent had gone to buying Margaret 6 more months, then 3, then 6 weeks of cognitive clarity before the cancer took even that. The bedroom Kenneth had given him measured 10 by 12. James had measured it the first day, force of habit from years estimating wire runs and load calculations. He paid $400 a month cash placed in an envelope on the kitchen counter every first of the month. He fixed the garbage disposal that had been broken for 2 years. He replaced 3 outlets that sparked. He cleaned gutters, patched the roof, rewired the basement panel box that had been installed wrong by whatever contractor Kenneth had hired. The weather forecast scrolled across the television screen in the living room, volume muted. Polar vortex. Temperature projections bottoming out at -40, possibly worse. The meteorologist's face carried that particular blend of excitement and concern that came with record-breaking cold. James had lived through bad winters before. The blizzard of '96, when he'd worked 72 hours straight keeping emergency generators running at the hospital. The ice storm of 2009 that had knocked out power for 11 days. Cold was physics. Insulation values, heat transfer coefficients, BTU calculations per cubic foot of space. Kenneth appeared in the kitchen doorway at 6:15 earlier than usual for a Saturday. He wore the careful expression of someone who'd rehearsed a difficult conversation. Rebecca followed 30 seconds later, her hand resting unconsciously on her stomach in that protective gesture James had seen 1,000 times in waiting rooms and grocery stores. Kenneth cleared his throat. The sound carried across the kitchen like a starter pistol. "Dad, Rebecca and I need to talk to you about something." James set his mug down on the counter, centering it on a water ring that had been there since before he'd moved in. The note said serious. "We're having a baby." Rebecca's voice carried forced brightness. "We found out 3 weeks ago. We're about 4 months along." The calculation happened automatically. 4 months ago was September. Kenneth hadn't mentioned anything. 3 weeks of knowing, 3 weeks of not telling him, 3 weeks of whatever conversation had led to this moment. "Congratulations." James kept his voice level. "Margaret would have been happy." Kenneth's jaw tightened at his mother's name. He'd barely mentioned her since the funeral, as if grief were something that could be filed away and forgotten like outdated tax returns. "We need to convert your room to a nursery." Kenneth's words came faster now, the rehearsed speech accelerating past the difficult parts. "We need the space. The baby's coming in April and we have to get everything ready and we can't—" "How long do I have?" 2 weeks. Kenneth wouldn't meet his eyes. "I know it's not much time, but we really need to start preparing, and real estate in winter is tough. But maybe you could find something, or there are apartments that—" "I've looked at apartments." James had actually 3 days after moving in, knowing this exact moment would arrive eventually. "Rent's $800 minimum for anything that isn't condemned. I'm pulling in $1,240 a month on disability. That leaves me $445 after your rent here. Take out $95 for phone and storage, and I've got $350 for food, gas, medical, copays, everything else. The math sat between them like a body on the kitchen table. Kenneth's salary as an accountant pulled in $63,000 a year. Rebecca worked part-time at a dental office. They weren't rich, but they weren't counting pennies at the grocery store either. Rebecca shifted her weight. We can help with the first month somewhere. We have about $500 we can spare. $500. James calculated automatically 12 days in the cheapest motel he could find, the one out by the interstate where the heating barely worked and you could hear trucks downshifting all night. Then what the disability check wouldn't stretch to cover rent and survival both. The medical bills from Margaret's treatment took $380 every month, a payment plan that wouldn't end until 2028. The collection agency had made it clear that missing payments meant lawsuits, wage garnishment worse. I appreciate that. James picked up his mug, found it had gone cold. I'll figure something out. Kenneth's relief was visible, physical, like a man who'd been holding his breath underwater. We can pack your stuff, help you move it, whatever you need. James nodded once and left the kitchen. Behind him he heard Rebecca whisper something, and Kenneth's reply, too low to make out the words, but the tone clear enough. Problem solved. Crisis averted. Move forward. In his room, James opened the notebook where he tracked every dollar. Disability check due in 4 days, $1,240. Current cash on hand, $134.16. The $500 from Kenneth would bring the total to $761 once his disability check cleared. The storage unit held everything he'd kept from the house: Margaret's photo albums, his professional tools, boxes of electrical components he'd accumulated over decades, teaching materials from a weekend course he'd taken on industrial safety. The shelters he'd called 3 months ago just to know the options had waiting lists stretching into March. The subsidized housing lottery had 1,800 names ahead of his. Friends from work had scattered after the plant closing in 2019. His sister lived in Oregon with a husband who'd made his feelings about freeloaders crystal clear at Margaret's funeral. James pulled his winter coat from the closet, the heavy Carhartt he'd bought in 2003 and maintained religiously every season. The lining was intact. The zippers worked. The pockets held a lighter he didn't remember putting there, and a folded receipt from a gas station dated 2 years ago. The temperature outside had already dropped to 28 degrees. By nightfall, it would hit 15. By Tuesday, according to the forecast, -20 at best. The worst cold snap in 30 years, the meteorologist had said, with barely concealed glee. Record lows, historic freeze, prepare for power outages and travel emergencies. James spent the first night in his truck, a 2003 F-150 with 212,000 miles and a heater that worked as long as the engine ran. He'd parked in the lot behind the closed textile mill, the one that had employed 600 people before moving operations to Vietnam. The engine's rumble covered the sound of his breathing, the occasional shudder of his body trying to conserve heat. At midnight, the fuel gauge read half full. At 3 a.m., it showed a quarter tank. At 5:15, the engine coughed twice and died, fuel-exhausted heat bleeding away into the pre-dawn darkness. His hands were numb when he managed to start the engine again using the emergency gas can he kept behind the seat. 5 gallons enough to get somewhere with cheaper fuel, but that somewhere required a destination he didn't have. The dashboard thermometer read -4 outside. His breath fogged the windshield until he had to crack the window, letting in air so cold it felt like breathing broken glass. $40 in gas gone in one night. The math was simple and brutal. He couldn't afford to sleep in the truck again. The rural roads outside town stretched through farmland that had been consolidating for decades. Family plots sold off to corporate agriculture houses left empty barns collapsing under their own weight. James drove slowly, scanning each property for something, anything that might offer shelter. The locked barn with intact walls but padlocked doors. The condemned house with yellow tape and a foundation that had shifted enough to crack every window. The garage missing 2 walls and most of its roof. He almost missed it. The sign was small, half buried in snow. The paint faded to barely legible, "For sale, $8. $8. James stopped the truck transmission grinding into park. The structure behind the sign was a Quonset hut, maybe 12 feet wide and 20 long, the curved corrugated metal scarred with rust but apparently intact. No visible holes in the roof. The snow around it was undisturbed except for deer tracks. The property belonged to a farmhouse set back from the road, smoke rising from its chimney. James knocked on the door and waited. The woman who answered was in her 70s, gray hair pulled back, eyes that had seen enough to recognize exactly what was standing on her porch. The hut. Her voice was rough from years of cigarettes. Husband died 3 years back. Been trying to sell it ever since. Price is what it says. $8? You got $8? James pulled out his wallet and counted out 8 ones. The woman took them, disappeared inside, and returned with a handwritten receipt and a ring of keys. It's on the property line. She pointed toward a path through the trees. Follow the tracks. Previous owner used it for storage. Then he tried living in it couple winters ago. Search and rescue found him in March. James stopped counting the keys. Found him. Froze to death. Stove went out, ran out of propane, temperatures hit 50 below. She met his eyes. You planning to live in it? Temporarily. She handed him the keys and the receipt. Temporarily gets people killed out here. You seem like you know that already. The hut was worse up close. Rust had eaten through sections of the metal, leaving jagged edges that caught the weak morning light. The door hung crooked on hinges that screamed when James forced it open. Inside, the space smelled of rust and old wood and something else, something organic and wrong. Snow had blown in through gaps he couldn't see yet, creating drifts in the corners. The temperature inside was maybe 5 degrees warmer than outside, if that. A frozen sleeping bag lay against the far wall. An empty propane tank sat next to a makeshift stove. Tools scattered across the floor, a level and a hammer and a handsaw with the blade snapped in half. James picked up the sleeping bag and found it stiff as plywood. Underneath was a notebook, pages frozen together, the last entry visible through the ice. Too cold. Can't feel feet. Stove went out. No more propane. The handwriting got shakier toward the end, the final letters barely formed. February 14th, Valentine's Day. James thought about the search and rescue team finding this, the body frozen in whatever position it had fallen, the equipment that had failed, the mistakes that had accumulated until there was no margin left for error. He set the notebook down carefully and began his inventory. The hut measured 12 feet wide by 22 feet long, giving him 264 square feet of space. The metal walls were single-layer corrugated steel, maybe 18 gauge, with zero insulation. The door gaps measured roughly an inch on 3 sides. The floor was bare earth, frozen solid, uneven. 5 visible holes in the roof, none larger than a quarter. The chimney hole where the previous stove had vented was capped with sheet metal held in place by wire. James's training kicked in automatically, the decades of load calculations and failure analysis. Single-layer metal in -40 temperatures meant the interior would equilibrate to maybe 5 degrees above ambient at best. Human body at rest generated roughly 350 BTUs per hour. Active movement could double that. But radiant heat loss through uninsulated metal walls would strip away every BTU he could generate within minutes. The previous owner's mistake was obvious now. Propane is a single point of failure. When the tank emptied, the system collapsed instantly. The notebook in the truck held his current resources, $627 after buying the hut. Kenneth's disability check would clear in 2 days, adding another $1,240. Total working capital, $1,867 for materials, food, fuel, everything needed to survive until spring. Spring meant April, maybe May. 12 weeks minimum. 18 if the winter ran long. James sat in the truck and created a list. Not what he wanted, but what was absolutely necessary to not die. Heat source with redundancy. Insulation barrier between body and metal. Ventilation system to prevent carbon monoxide poisoning. Water supply. Food supply. Emergency signaling in case of injury or system failure. The hardware store on Route 19 was owned by a man named Stephen Clark, who'd been in the electrical supply business before the plant closed. James had bought wire and components from him for 20 years. The store was mostly empty when James walked in, boots tracking snow across the worn linoleum. Stephen looked up from behind the counter, recognition immediate. James Walker. Heard about Margaret. I'm sorry. Appreciate it. What can I do for you? James pulled out his list. Need to build a heating system. Budget's tight. Stephen scanned the list without comment. Chimney pipe sections, metal, cement, mineral wool, insulation, wire mesh, work gloves. His eyes stopped on the total James had calculated, $95. You living somewhere without heat? Quonset hut off Miller Road. Stephen's expression shifted. The one where they found that guy last year? Same one. Stephen disappeared into the back storage area and returned with a stack of insulation bales. These got water damage last month. Can't sell them full price, but they're still good if you dry them out. Take them no charge. I pay for what I use. Fine. Call it $20 for all of it. Stephen pulled out chimney sections. These are discontinued, 50% off. He rang up the order, the register clicking through each item. That's 83 total. You got 83? James counted out bills and coins. I've got it. Stephen bagged the cement and smaller items. Donald Harris lives about 3 miles from that hut. Gulf War vet. He knows cold weather survival better than anyone I've met. You run into trouble, he's your best option. The name went into James's mental file. Donald Harris, 3 miles, Gulf War vet. Loading the truck took 15 minutes. Driving back to the hut took another 10. The sun was already dropping toward the horizon, temperatures falling with it. James had maybe 3 hours of workable daylight left. The chimney installation followed the procedure he'd done 100 times in industrial settings. Measure the roof penetration point. Cut the hole with metal shears. Position the pipe vertically. Seal with metal cement rated for high temperatures. The work was mechanical automatic, his hands remembering the movements even when his brain was calculating heat loss coefficients and BTU requirements. The first test with a small fire of scrap wood sent smoke billowing back into the hut. James analyzed the problem, no chimney cap wind creating downdraft. The solution was improvised from an old coffee can, holes punched for ventilation positioned to deflect wind while allowing smoke to escape. The second test worked. Smoke drew cleanly through the pipe and dispersed into the gray sky. But the heat situation was worse than the calculations had suggested. With a fire burning steadily, the temperature near the stove reached 65 degrees. At the walls, it measured 28. James could literally feel the gradient warm air rising to the curved ceiling and immediately being stripped of energy by the uninsulated metal. Every BTU the fire generated bled away into the frozen night. He spent the remaining daylight installing the damaged insulation. The mineral wool went between wood slats scavenged from broken pallets, creating an air gap between the metal and the insulation layer. The work was slow and brutal, hands going numb every 10 minutes, forcing him to stop and warm them near the fire. By the time darkness fell completely, he'd covered maybe a third of the wall space. The first night in the hut taught James what the previous owner had learned too late. The temperature dropped to -41 outside. Inside, with the fire burning continuously and the partial insulation, it bottomed out at 38 degrees. James lay on the frozen ground wrapped in 2 blankets and his winter coat shivering so hard his teeth chattered uncontrollably. Sleep came in 15-minute increments between fire maintenance. Every 2 hours he had to get up, add wood, adjust the airflow, verify the chimney wasn't blocked with ice. The stove he'd built from an oil drum worked, but it was inefficient. Maybe 30% of the heat energy actually radiated into the space. The rest went up the chimney or was lost to incomplete combustion. James calculated fuel consumption in the weak light of his flashlight. At current burn rate, he'd need to source wood constantly. There wasn't enough deadfall within walking distance to sustain this through winter. Day 3 brought a new crisis. The moisture from his breathing condensed on the cold metal walls and dripped back down, creating puddles that would freeze and thaw with the fire cycle. The insulation he'd installed was getting wet. Wet insulation lost its R value, becoming worthless. James spent the morning creating a vapor barrier from plastic sheeting he found at a construction site 2 miles away. The plastic went over the insulation sealed with duct tape he couldn't really afford but couldn't survive without. The work was constant. Build the fire, monitor the temperature, melt snow for water, ration food, patch gaps, reinforce weak points. Every task generated 3 more tasks. The door seal needed weather stripping. The floor needed elevation to prevent heat loss to the frozen ground. The chimney needed guy wires to stabilize it against wind. The stove needed a damper to control burn rate. On day 8, Kenneth appeared at the hut entrance. James heard the car engine first, then the door slam, then footsteps crunching through snow. He'd been reinforcing the insulation in the back corner, hands raw from handling the rough mineral wool. Kenneth stood in the doorway staring. His face cycled through shock, horror, and something else James couldn't quite identify. Guilt, maybe, or just discomfort at seeing the consequences of his decision made physical. "Dad?" The word came out strangled. "Are you living here?" "For now." "Jesus Christ, it's not safe. You could die out here." James set down the insulation. "I'm managing." "This is—" Kenneth gestured at the space, at the rust, at the improvised systems held together with wire and hope. "You can't stay here. I need you to sign something." Kenneth pulled an envelope from his coat. "Life insurance paperwork. Rebecca needs to be the primary beneficiary now, for the baby." James wiped his hands on his jeans and took the envelope. The forms inside were standard change of beneficiary documents. Kenneth's work policy, $250,000. Currently, James was listed as the sole beneficiary, a leftover from when Kenneth had first started the job and hadn't yet married. "Of course." James found a pen and signed where indicated. "The baby should be protected." Kenneth watched him sign, the tension in his shoulders, suggesting he'd expected an argument. "That $500, did it help?" "It helped." James handed back the envelope. "I bought this place for $8, spent the rest on materials." $8? Kenneth's voice climbed. "For this? It's shelter. It's mine. It's what I could afford." Kenneth pulled out his wallet and extracted $200 in 20s. "Here, for materials, or food, or whatever you need." He set the bills on the makeshift shelf James had built from scrap lumber. "It's not charity. It's payment for all the work you did on the house, the electrical, the roof, all of it." James didn't touch the money. "You don't owe me for that. Just take it." Kenneth's voice carried an edge now, frustration or anger or something else. "Please." The silence stretched between them, filled with everything they weren't saying. Margaret's death, the years of distance, the careful avoidance of real conversation. Kenneth standing in the doorway of a rusted hut, watching his father try to survive winter in a metal box and still not offering to let him stay. "Why didn't you save money?" Kenneth's question came out harsh. "Mom's treatment, I know it was expensive, but $47,000, all of it. It bought her 6 more months, 3 months of good days, 6 weeks where she knew who I was." James met Kenneth's eyes. "I'd make the same choice again." Kenneth's face did something complicated. Insurance didn't cover it. Not experimental treatments, not the trial drug, not the specialists from Houston. James's voice stayed level. "The day she died, the bill was $47,312. I sold the house for $93,000. After the mortgage payoff, I had $48,000 left. I paid the hospital. The rest went to moving cost storage, trying to figure out what came next." The math sat between them again, brutal and simple. Every choice with a cost. Every cost with a consequence. Kenneth left the $200 and drove away. James stood in the doorway watching the taillights disappear, then counted the bills. $200. Added to his remaining balance that brought his resources to $754 until the disability check cleared. The temperature was dropping again. The forecast called for -48 by midnight. James sealed the door and fed the fire and tried not to think about Kenneth's face, about the relief when James signed the insurance forms, about the guilty money left behind, like a tip for services rendered. The storm hit on day 10 with a violence that made the previous cold seem gentle. The wind howled across the metal walls, finding every gap, every weakness, every point, where James's improvised repairs fell short of actual structural integrity. Snow drove horizontally, piling against the windward side of the hut in drifts that threatened to bury the door completely. James had prepared as well as his resources allowed. 5 days of firewood stacked inside, 12 gallons of water melted and stored in scavenged containers, food rationed to stretch through 3 days of being unable to leave. The door sealed with duct tape and rags stuffed into the gaps. The chimney secured with guy wires attached to stakes driven into the frozen ground. The fire burned continuously, but the heat was losing ground. The internal temperature dropped from 45 degrees to 40, then to 35. James fed the fire, constantly burning through his carefully rationed wood supply faster than planned. The chimney drew well until hour 14, when ice began forming at the cap restricting airflow. Smoke started backing up into the hut. James had to choose: go outside in negative 48-degree temperatures to fix the chimney, or stay inside and suffocate. The choice wasn't really a choice. He wrapped his scarf over his face, pulled on both pairs of gloves, and forced open the door against the wind. The cold was a physical assault. It hit his exposed skin like electricity, burning and numbing simultaneously. His eyes watered and the tears froze on his cheeks. He couldn't breathe without the scarf, and breathing through the scarf filled his lungs with fabric fibers and ice crystals. The ladder to the roof was coated with ice. His gloves struggled for grip. 8 minutes, he'd calculated. 8 minutes maximum before frostbite became irreversible. The chimney cap was encased in ice an inch thick. James chipped at it with the screwdriver he'd brought, each impact sending vibrations through hands already going numb. The cap came free after 4 minutes of work. He secured it with wire, checked the guy lines, and descended. 7 minutes outside. His hands were white when he pulled off the gloves inside. He ran them under cool water from his stored supply, not warm, watching the color return as blood flow resumed. No blistering, no tissue damage, just pain that felt like his fingers were being crushed in a vise. The storm lasted 36 hours. James maintained the fire in 2-hour cycles, sleeping in 15-minute increments. His body too cold and too wired on adrenaline to achieve anything deeper. He hallucinated twice, once seeing Margaret sitting by the fire telling him to come to bed. Her voice so real he actually stood up before realizing the space was empty. Once hearing Kenneth outside the door saying, "Dad, let me in," but when James checked, there was only wind and snow and darkness. At hour 28, James tied a rope from his wrist to a pot of screws positioned on the shelf. If he fell asleep and stopped moving, the pot would fall. The noise would wake him. The system worked. The pot fell 3 times. Each time, James jerked awake, disoriented, checking the fire first, then his extremities for frostbite, then the chimney for blockages. When the storm finally broke on the morning of day 12, the sun came out and the temperature climbed to negative 28. James opened the door and stood in the sunlight, too exhausted to feel triumph, too numb to feel relief. He'd survived. The hut had held. The systems had worked, barely, but worked. The journal entry that night was short. Day 11, survived worst storm yet. The hut works, I work. Tomorrow gather more wood. Reinforce door seal, check insulation for damage. 1 day at a time. James lay on his elevated platform bed, wrapped in 3 blankets, and watched the fire burn down to coals. The temperature inside was holding at 42 degrees. Outside, the thermometer read negative 31. 12 weeks until spring. 12 weeks of this, or worse. The previous owner had made it to week 8 before dying. James was entering week 2. His hands ached. His back ached. His lungs ached from breathing cold air for days. But he was alive. The $8 hut had cost him $8 and everything else he had to give. And it wasn't enough yet. Tomorrow would demand more. The day after that, more still. James closed his eyes and forced his breathing to slow, to conserve heat, to let his body rest, while his mind continued calculating, planning, surviving. Week 3 began with a problem James should have anticipated. The snow he'd been melting for water consumed 45 minutes of fuel per gallon, burning through wood he needed for heat. The inefficiency gnawed at him while he fed precious kindling into the fire, watching ice turn to slush, turn to water that tasted flat and metallic, but kept him alive. The solution came from observation rather than engineering. Black plastic containers positioned outside absorbed solar radiation during the brief daylight hours, melting snow passively. James scavenged 5-gallon buckets from the construction site where he'd found the vapor barrier. Plastic painted them black with leftover spray paint from the hardware store dumpster and arranged them in a south-facing line. The system produced 3 gallons daily when the sun cooperated 0 when clouds blocked the radiation. He stored the output in a styrofoam cooler insulated with mineral wool scraps, the water staying liquid for up to 18 hours before freezing solid. The filtration setup was primitive but functional. Coffee filters layered with activated charcoal Stephen had sold him for $2, the whole assembly rigged into a gravity feed system using plastic tubing. The result was water that didn't make him sick, which was the only standard that mattered anymore. Food tracking became religious practice. James maintained a spreadsheet in his notebook, every calorie logged, every meal calculated against the dwindling supply. Rice and beans formed the foundation, $12 for 20 pounds of rice, $8 for 10 pounds of dried beans. Oatmeal for breakfast, 46 cents per serving. Canned vegetables at $1.19 per can, rationed to 1 every 3 days. Peanut butter provided protein and calories, $9 for 3 jars, that would last 6 weeks if he measured each serving precisely. The math was unforgiving. 1,800 calories daily, the minimum to maintain body mass in extreme cold conditions. At current consumption rate, his $85 food supply would exhaust in 42 days. Spring was at least 70 days away, probably more. The gap between supply and need was a chasm he hadn't figured out how to cross yet. The improvement cycle generated failures faster than successes. James built shelving from scrap lumber to elevate food supplies off the frozen ground. The first shelf collapsed under 20 pounds of canned goods. The supporting bracket he'd cut from sheet metal buckling at a stress point he'd miscalculated. 3 cans dented beyond safe consumption. The replacement shelf used triangulated supports load distributed across 3 points instead of 2. The engineering principle he should have applied from the start. The floor insulation attempt nearly killed him. James had laid plastic sheeting directly on the frozen earth, then mineral wool, then plywood scavenged from a demolished shed. The plastic trapped moisture from ground vapor, creating a breeding ground for black mold that appeared within 72 hours. The spores made him cough until his ribs ached, each breath scraping his lungs raw. He tore out the entire assembly, losing materials and 2 days of work. The replacement system used an air gap created by 2x4s, allowing ground moisture to vent while providing thermal break between frozen earth and living space. The platform bed worked. 6 inches of elevation made a measurable difference, his body no longer fighting direct conductive heat loss to frozen ground. James could sleep for 90 consecutive minutes now instead of 45, the extra rest allowing his body to repair damage accumulated during waking hours. Week 5 brought a visitor James hadn't expected. The knock on the hut door came at 9 in the morning, 3 sharp raps that sounded wrong against the metal. James opened the door to find a man in his late 60s military posture, despite the decades since discharge eyes that assessed the situation in 3 seconds and made accurate conclusions. "You're the guy in the Quonset. Stephen mentioned you. I'm Donald Harris." No handshake offered no wasted movement. "I survived worse than this in the Gulf. You're making mistakes that'll kill you by March." James's first instinct was defensive pride. He'd survived 3 weeks' weathered storms, built systems that functioned. But the previous owner had survived 8 weeks before dying, and James's timeline to spring was 3 times that long. Pride was a luxury he couldn't afford. "Come in." Donald stepped inside and performed a systematic inspection, touching nothing, observing everything. The stove, the insulation, the ventilation system, the food storage, the water supply. His face revealed nothing until he pointed at the oil drum stove. "You're burning 60% more wood than necessary. That thing's hemorrhaging heat straight up the chimney." By February, you won't be able to gather enough fuel to maintain temperature. The assessment landed like a punch. James had calculated fuel consumption, had estimated available deadfall within walking distance, but his projections assumed current efficiency levels. If Donald was right, the gap between available fuel and required fuel would force impossible choices. The ventilation's wrong, too. Donald indicated the carefully positioned gaps James had left for air circulation. You're trying to balance fresh air against heat retention. Smart, but inadequate. Come March, you'll have enough carbon monoxide accumulated in here to kill you in your sleep, even with that detector. James glanced at the CO detector Stephen had included with his hardware purchase, the small digital readout currently showing 0 parts per million. It's been reading safe since I installed it. Now it is. Wait until you've got ice buildup forcing you to seal every gap. Wait until you're burning wet wood because dry's gone. Wait until you're too exhausted to notice the headaches starting. Donald's voice carried the weight of experience of seeing people make fatal errors with the best intentions. You don't have a plan B. What happens when you get sick? When you break an ankle? When the stove fails at 2 a.m. in -50? The questions exposed vulnerabilities James had been deliberately not thinking about. Single points of failure, no redundancy, no margin for error. Donald spent the next 2 days teaching James to build a rocket stove. The principle was elegant, a vertical combustion chamber lined with insulation, forcing hot gases through a heat riser that extracted maximum energy before venting. The fuel burned hotter and more completely, generating the same heat output from a third of the wood consumption. The construction used materials James could source: metal pipe sections, fire bricks he couldn't afford, until Donald produced 6 cracked ones from his truck, insulating material packed around the combustion chamber to retain heat. James's electrical background helped him grasp the physics. The relationship between airflow velocity and combustion efficiency, the way thermal mass stored and radiated energy over time. The first test burn was revelation. The rocket stove consumed a handful of kindling and produced heat that filled the hut within 20 minutes. The exhaust gas temperature at the chimney was 200 degrees lower than the oil drum stove, meaning more energy stayed in the living space instead of escaping to atmosphere. James calculated fuel savings immediately. This extended his viable survival timeline by 5 weeks, possibly more. Donald's knowledge went beyond stove construction. He taught moisture management, showing James how to create ventilation that moved air without creating drafts, how to position the vapor barrier to prevent condensation while allowing trapped moisture to escape gradually. The food preservation techniques were practical and specific: rice stored in sealed containers with oxygen absorbers, to prevent mold; beans kept in breathable bags to allow moisture escape; rotation systems that ensured nothing sat long enough to spoil. The emergency protocols were non-negotiable. Weekly check-ins every Saturday at 10 a.m. Coffee at Stephen's hardware store. Miss 1 week, Donald would call. Miss 2 consecutive weeks, Donald would assume emergency and come investigate. James agreed immediately, recognizing the system for what it was: a dead man's switch proof of life, the difference between dying alone and having someone notice. I'm not saving you. Donald's statement was flat factual. I'm giving you the information. You do the work. You make the choices. But don't die from ignorance when knowledge is available. James accepted the terms. Donald wasn't offering friendship or charity, just data transfer from someone who'd survived worse conditions and wanted that experience to mean something. On Saturday morning, James drove to Stephen's hardware store and drank bad coffee while Donald assessed his physical condition, asked specific questions about system performance, and offered targeted solutions to emerging problems. The theft attempt came during week 6. 2 men appearing at midday when James was gathering deadfall a quarter-mile from the hut. He heard the truck engine first, the rough idle of a vehicle running on bad fuel, then voices, then the sound of the hut door being forced open. James approached quietly through the trees, staying out of sight, assessing the situation before committing to action. The men were in their 30s, bodies carrying the skeletal thinness and jerky movements of methamphetamine users. One was inside the hut, the other standing guard, both wearing inadequate clothing for the temperature. Desperation made people stupid, and stupid made them dangerous. This is on public land. The guard's voice was too loud, overcompensating for uncertainty. We got records from the county. You can't claim abandoned property without filing. James stepped into view, hands visible, posture non-threatening. I have a purchase receipt and a deed copy. This is private property and I bought it legally. The man inside the hut emerged carrying James's toolbox, the one containing his electrical multimeter and wire strippers. Old man, you can't defend this place. Take the hint and walk away. James calculated his options. He was outnumbered, outweighed, and fighting would accomplish nothing except injuries he couldn't afford to sustain. But yielding would establish precedent, mark him as vulnerable, invite repeat attempts. Donald Harris checks on me twice a week. He was Special Forces in the Gulf, you probably know him. The lie was specific enough to be believable, vague enough to be unverifiable. He's expecting me tomorrow morning. If I don't show, he comes looking. The name registered. The men exchanged glances, the calculation visible, potential reward versus certain consequences. The one holding the toolbox set it down carefully and backed toward the truck. They drove away, taking only the exterior tools James had left visible, maybe $40 worth of equipment he'd positioned specifically to be stolen if theft was inevitable. The loss was acceptable. The vulnerability was not. James spent the afternoon making the hut appear poorer from the outside, hiding improvements, removing any visible sign of value or comfort. Looking desperate was protection. Looking like someone surviving rather than someone thriving made him beneath notice, not worth the effort of robbery. Saturday's check-in with Donald included a full report. Donald listened without interrupting, then taught security measures that didn't require weapons. Fishing lines stretched at ankle height connected to tin cans filled with screws, creating an alarm perimeter. A removable panel in the back wall of the hut held in place with magnets instead of screws, allowing emergency exit if the front door was blocked. Simple rules: never confront, always retreat, always get help. James installed the systems that night, testing the alarm by deliberately triggering it, confirming the noise was loud enough to wake him from deep sleep. He practiced the emergency exit sequence until muscle memory took over, until he could go from horizontal to outside in under 8 seconds. The previous owner had died because the door was his only exit and he'd been too weak to use it. James wouldn't make that mistake. The food crisis arrived in week 7, 2 weeks earlier than his spreadsheet projected. He'd burned more calories than calculated the constant physical labor and cold exposure demanding fuel his body extracted from stored reserves. James counted remaining supplies: rice for 3 weeks, beans for 2, oatmeal, exhausted canned vegetables down to 6 cans, peanut butter nearly gone. His remaining cash was $127. Spring was 5 weeks away minimum. The calculation was brutal and simple. He couldn't make it on current resources. James considered options he'd been avoiding. Asking Kenneth for money would mean admitting failure, validating Kenneth's assessment that this situation was unsustainable. The soup kitchen was 40 miles away, the gas cost equaling the food value. The local church food bank served families, not single men who'd made choices that led to living in metal huts. Pride fought with survival, and survival was winning, but pride made one last stand with the question, was there any other way? Stephen's offer arrived like an answer to a prayer James hadn't voiced. I've got a proposition. Stephen's voice was casual, but his eyes were calculating. Need electrical work on the shop. Panel box is throwing sparks. Half the outlets are dead. The whole system's a fire hazard waiting to happen. You know electrical better than anyone in 3 counties. I can pay $200 in store credit or $140 cash. Your choice. James chose credit immediately. $200 in materials stretched farther than $140 in food, and the work was something he could do with his eyes closed. Rewiring a panel box was muscle memory from 35 years of industrial electrical, the kind of job he could complete in 2 days without references or blueprints. The work felt good. His hands remembered the procedures, the careful sequence of shutdowns and tests and connections that ensured safety and code compliance. Stephen watched for the first hour, then left him alone. Trust implicit. James worked methodically, replacing corroded breakers, rerouting overloaded circuits, installing GFCI outlets in wet locations. The panel box went from disaster to textbook installation. Every wire labeled, every connection torqued to specification, every ground verified. Stephen inspected the finished work and nodded once. Professional grade, better than the contractor who did the original install. He updated James's credit balance $200. You need more work, I'll find it. You've got skills people need. The credit bought rice beans oatmeal in bulk quantities, canned vegetables by the case, peanut butter, cooking oil, salt, multivitamins. James carried the supplies to the hut in 3 trips, his truck groaning under the weight, and restocked his shelves with a buffer he hadn't felt in weeks. The food would last through spring now, possibly into early summer if he stayed disciplined. Word spread through mechanisms James didn't fully understand. Stephen mentioned his name to someone who mentioned it to someone else. The small jobs started arriving: fix a trailer light for $20 cash, repair a generator that wouldn't start for $35, wire a new outlet in a garage for $50. James set rules and stuck to them: cash payment on completion, no credit work, no favors owed. The money was small but consistent, $200 to $300 monthly, enough to supplement his disability income and create actual margin between survival and catastrophe. The teaching began accidentally. A man in his 40s appeared at the hut entrance, nervous energy and desperate eyes. Stephen said, "You survived the -54 last week. I got laid off from the plant, might lose my house in March. How'd you make it?" James showed him the rocket stove, explaining the principle without technical jargon, demonstrating fuel consumption versus heat output. The man absorbed the information like someone drinking after days in desert. "Can you help me build one? I'll pay whatever you need." James considered the request. Time was currency he couldn't afford to waste, but knowledge was currency that multiplied through transfer. "I'll show you how. You do the work. Bring materials, and I'll teach the process." They spent a weekend building a rocket stove in the man's garage, James correcting mistakes before they became failures, explaining the why behind each decision. The man offered $100 payment. James refused. "Buy materials for your family. Keep them warm. That's payment enough." The man left firewood instead, 3 cords stacked neatly outside the hut, and 2 cases of canned soup. The barter value was roughly $40. James accepted it as fair exchange: knowledge for materials, expertise for resources neither party had to assign monetary value to. Saturday check-ins with Donald became something beyond simple proof of life. They talked systems theory, failure analysis, risk mitigation. Donald had seen cold weather kill people in Iraq, soldiers who'd survived combat dying from exposure because they'd made assumptions about desert nights. The lessons translated: single points of failure were death sentences, redundancy was survival. Pride was the enemy of living through March. Week 8 brought weather that made previous storms seem gentle. The forecast called for -52, possibly colder, sustained for 72 hours minimum. The polar vortex was shifting south again, bringing Arctic air masses that would set records. Meteorologists used words like historic and life-threatening and unsurvivable for extended exposure. James prepared like he was planning a military operation. He brought 5 days of firewood inside, stacking it against the wall farthest from the stove to prevent moisture loss while keeping fuel accessible. 12 gallons of water in sealed containers, melted and filtered in advance. Food pre-portioned for 9 meals. No need to open doors or expose containers to temperature fluctuations. The rocket stove optimized every connection, checked the combustion chamber cleared of ash buildup. Every seal inspected, every gap verified closed, every backup system tested. The emergency gear staged within arm's reach, backup lighter, candles for redundant heat source if the stove failed, extra blankets. First aid supplies, the carbon monoxide detector with fresh batteries. James created a checklist of 47 items and verified each one twice. The previous owner had died during a storm like this. James had survived -48. This would be worse. The temperature began dropping at noon, falling 2 degrees per hour, the descent steady and merciless. -30 by sunset, -40 by midnight, -47 by 3 a.m. James maintained the fire in 90-minute cycles, setting his alarm, forcing himself awake, checking the stove, adding fuel, verifying the chimney drew cleanly. Sleep came in 30-minute increments, never deep enough for dreams, just enough to prevent total collapse. Hour 13 brought the first crisis. The temperature outside hit -51, and inside dropped to 48 despite the fire burning hot. The metal walls radiated cold like they were connected directly to the void of space every BTU the stove generated, struggling against the relentless heatsink of uninsulated steel. James added insulation over the existing layer using emergency blankets he'd bought with his last hardware store credit, the reflective material creating a radiant barrier. The internal temperature stabilized at 52 degrees. Hour 25 brought the critical failure. The chimney cap iced over again, thicker than last time, the moisture from combustion gases freezing on contact with metal exposed to -54 air. Smoke began backing into the hut, the carbon monoxide detector screaming its alarm, the display showing numbers climbing toward dangerous concentration. James had 7 minutes of breathable air, maybe less. Going outside meant exposing himself to temperatures that caused frostbite in under 2 minutes. Staying inside meant suffocation, carbon monoxide poisoning death while he slept. The choice was no choice at all. He wrapped his scarf triple layer over his face, pulled on both pairs of gloves, tucked his pants into his boots to prevent snow entry, and forced the door open against wind that hit like a physical barrier. The cold was a living thing, intelligent and malicious, seeking any exposed flesh, finding the gap between his glove and coat sleeve, exploiting the space where his scarf didn't quite meet his collar. His eyes watered, and the tears froze instantly, ice crystals blurring his vision. The ladder to the roof was coated in ice 2 inches thick. Each rung required careful placement, testing weight, ensuring grip before committing. James climbed slowly, his body screaming at him to rush his training, insisting on methodical caution. The chimney cap was encased in ice so thick he couldn't see the metal beneath. He chipped at it with the screwdriver clenched in frozen hands, each impact jarring his arm to the shoulder, progress measured in millimeters. 4 minutes outside. His hands were losing sensation despite the gloves. 5 minutes. The cap still wouldn't budge. 6 minutes. James's coordination was deteriorating, fine motor control disappearing, his hands becoming clubs that could grip but not manipulate. 7 minutes. The cap broke free, suddenly falling to the ground beside the hut with a sound like breaking glass. James descended the ladder faster than safe, his brain calculating that speed-related injury risk was lower than cold exposure injury certainty. 8 minutes total exposure. Inside the hut, he stripped off the gloves and ran his hands under cool water from his stored supply, fighting the screaming instinct to use warm water, knowing that would cause tissue damage. His fingers were white and waxy. He watched them carefully, looking for the purple-black of deep frostbite. The color returned slowly pink, then red, then normal. Pain followed crushing pressure, like his fingers were being slowly squeezed in a vise. No blistering, no permanent damage. Just pain that made him gasp and brace his hands against the wall until it subsided to manageable levels. The storm entered hour 37, and James entered territory the previous owner had never survived. Sleep deprivation was accumulating faster than he could compensate. He'd been awake for 42 of the last 48 hours. His body demanded rest, his situation couldn't allow. The hallucinations started, subtle peripheral movement that wasn't there, sounds beneath the wind that resolved into nothing. Then they escalated. Margaret sat by the fire warming her hands, telling him he should rest, that he'd done enough, that it was okay to stop now. Her voice was so clear, James answered before catching himself, before realizing he was alone. Kenneth's voice came through the door, muffled by wind but distinct. "Dad, let me in. It's too cold out here." James stood up, actually walked to the door, his hand on the handle, before his rational mind overrode the hallucination. Kenneth wasn't outside. Nobody was outside. Going to check would mean death. James tied a rope from his wrist to a pot of screws balanced on the shelf edge. If he fell asleep and stopped moving, if his arm went slack, the pot would fall. The crash would wake him. The system was crude but functional. The pot fell at hour 43, jarring James from a nightmare about drowning. It fell again at hour 50, jerking him awake from a half-sleep where he'd been convinced he was back in his old house, back when Margaret was alive, back before everything collapsed. Hour 68 brought a moment of clarity. James sat by the fire, feeding it carefully measured fuel, and understood with perfect certainty that he was either going to survive this or die trying, that there was no middle ground, no partial success. The previous owner had given up, had opened the door and walked into the cold, or had simply stopped feeding the fire, or had made some small error that cascaded into catastrophe. James would not give up. He would maintain the fire, maintain consciousness, maintain the systems that kept him alive for however many hours remained. The storm broke on the morning of day 12. The sun rose into a sky scoured clean of clouds, the temperature still -38, but climbing the wind, dying to almost nothing. James opened the door and stood in the sunlight, too exhausted for triumph, too depleted for relief. He'd survived. The hut had held. His systems had worked. He'd lost 8 pounds in 3 days. His hands were frostbitten, but healing his sleep debt was a crushing weight that demanded payment. He slept 16 consecutive hours, waking only once to add wood to the fire, his body shutting down every non-essential system to repair accumulated damage. When he finally woke fully, it was late afternoon of day 13. The temperature had climbed to -20. Inside the hut, the thermometer read 56 degrees. James drank water, forced down food his stomach didn't want, and updated his journal. Survived -54. Systems proven. I can do this. Donald's visit the next day was brief. He inspected the hut, checked James's hands for frostbite progression, asked specific questions about system performance during the storm. His assessment was delivered without drama. "You're tougher than you look." James considered the statement. "The hut's tougher than it looks." "That too." Donald turned to leave, then paused. "You proved something these last 3 days. To yourself mainly. Most people would have quit. You didn't. That matters." The statement settled into James's understanding of his situation. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was proving a principle that adaptation mattered more than circumstances, that knowledge could overcome resource scarcity, that a man at 58 wasn't finished if he refused to be finished. Week 9 began with a mental shift James couldn't have predicted. He stopped thinking about the hut as temporary shelter, stopped waiting for rescue or opportunity to move somewhere better. This was the plan. This was his life now. He was building something sustainable, not enduring something until it ended. The difference seemed semantic, but changed everything. The teaching accelerated organically. Stephen started referring people who needed help. Someone winterizing a shed on a tight budget, a young couple trying to make a camper livable through winter, a veteran whose disability check didn't cover rent and utilities both. James helped each one, sometimes for cash, sometimes for barter, sometimes for nothing, when the need was obvious and the resources absent. Every session taught him something: how to explain concepts without jargon, how to diagnose problems from descriptions, how to match solutions to specific constraints. A woman in her 50s paid him $60 to teach her rocket stove construction, then brought him 2 cords of firewood worth twice that amount. A young man traded electrical repair work on the hut for knowledge about heat management and moisture control. The exchanges built a reputation James hadn't sought, but couldn't avoid the guy who knew how to survive on nothing, who'd turned an $8 metal hut into a functioning home, who had skills people needed and would share them. The income stream solidified into reliable monthly flow. Electrical work brought $200 to $400. Teaching and consulting generated another $50 to $100 in cash plus barter goods worth roughly the same. Combined with disability income, James was pulling in $1,700 to $1,800 monthly, more than he'd had when living in Kenneth's house. The difference was control. Every dollar was his, earned through direct exchange of value, no debt attached, no favors, owed no obligations beyond the work itself. Saturday mornings at Stephen's hardware store evolved into informal office hours. People would arrive knowing James would be there, bringing questions about survival systems, budget living, practical skills their grandparents had known but they'd never learned. James drank bad coffee and answered questions, and realized he'd found something he hadn't known. He was searching for purpose beyond mere survival contribution that mattered, a reason to wake up that went beyond not dying. Donald noticed the change. "You're not just getting through winter anymore. You're building something that outlasts it." James nodded, watching steam rise from his coffee. "I didn't plan this. It just happened. Best things usually do. You make plans and life happens anyway. The question is whether you adapt or quit." "You adapted." Donald stood, preparing to leave. "Community college is looking for someone to teach practical skills. Stephen gave them your name. They'll call you next week." The information landed without immediate impact, filing itself away in James's mental queue of things to process later. Teaching at a community college meant exposure, visibility, formalizing what he'd been doing informally for weeks. It meant admitting publicly that his circumstances weren't temporary shame, but permanent reality he'd transformed into expertise. Margaret would have told him to do it. Margaret would have seen the opportunity before he did. Week 10 arrived with temperatures finally climbing above freezing during daylight hours. The snow began melting, creating drainage problems James hadn't anticipated. Water pooled around the hut's foundation, threatening to undermine the stability and flood the interior. He dug trenches, redirecting flow away from the structure, the work familiar from decades of managing water intrusion in industrial buildings. The shovel hit metal 3 feet down. James cleared soil carefully, revealing a toolbox professional grade buried deliberately. Inside, wrenches, levels, saws, drill bits, all in usable condition despite years underground. A note in a waterproof bag read, "For emergencies, J.W., 2019. James Walsh, the previous owner." The man who'd died in February 2 years ago, whose frozen journal James had read on his first day in the hut. Walsh had buried these as emergency backup insurance against catastrophic loss. But he'd never needed them because he'd died before the emergency arrived. The tools were worth $300 minimum, maybe more. James cleaned them carefully, inventoried each piece, and added them to his working collection. He thought about Walsh, about the preparation that hadn't been enough, about the planning that had failed at some critical juncture. The difference between them wasn't resources or knowledge, it was community. Walsh had died alone. James had Donald, Stephen, the growing network of people who knew where he was and checked that he was still breathing. Standing in the weak March sunlight, tools in hand, James understood that he'd crossed some invisible threshold. He was no longer the man who'd been kicked out of his son's house 3 months ago. He was someone else now, someone defined by what he'd built rather than what he'd lost. The transformation wasn't complete, but it was undeniable. The $8 hut had cost him everything and given him back something he couldn't name yet, but recognized as valuable beyond any dollar amount he could assign. The text message arrived late on a Tuesday evening in mid-March, the screen illuminating the dark interior of the hut with harsh blue light. Kenneth's name appeared above 3 short lines: "Baby girl, born 7 pounds 3 ounces, healthy. Emily Walker." James read the message twice, his thumb hovering over the keyboard, drafting and deleting responses that all sounded wrong. Congratulations felt inadequate. Questions about Rebecca's health seemed intrusive. Offers to visit would create obligations neither of them wanted. He settled on simplicity. "Congratulations. She's lucky to have you both." The response came immediately: "Thanks." One word. Professional courtesy between distant relatives. James set the phone down and returned to the electrical schematic he'd been drawing for a client's garage rewiring job. But his mind kept drifting to Kenneth's house, to a baby girl named Emily. Margaret's middle name, the detail Kenneth hadn't mentioned but James recognized immediately. The gesture was either reconciliation or coincidence, and James had no way to determine which without asking questions he wasn't ready to voice. 7 days later, a different message arrived from a number James didn't recognize. "This is Rebecca. Kenneth won't say it, but he wants you to meet Emily. Sunday 2 p.m. if you want." James stared at the screen for 10 full minutes, the message demanding a response that would determine trajectories for relationships he thought had already reached their terminal points. Going meant risking rejection again, exposing himself to judgment about his living situation, acknowledging that Kenneth's choice to exclude him had been valid even if James had survived it. Not going meant accepting permanent severance, choosing pride over the possibility of connection with a granddaughter he'd never meet. He typed, "I'll be there." Saturday night he borrowed Stephen's truck, the one without visible rust, and with a heater that actually worked. He washed his clothes in melted snow and detergent, dried them near the rocket stove, tried to make himself presentable in a way that wouldn't broadcast the reality of where he'd been sleeping for 16 weeks. The face in the small mirror he'd mounted above his washing station looked leaner, older, harder somehow. The weight loss had carved definition into his cheekbones, erased the softness that came from decades of steady meals and indoor heating. He looked like someone who'd survived something which was accurate but not the image he wanted to project, walking into Kenneth's house. Sunday at 2 p.m. James parked in Kenneth's driveway and sat for 30 seconds gathering resolve. The house looked exactly as he'd left it 4 months ago. The same peeling paint on the garage door, the same crooked mailbox he'd meant to straighten but never had. Different now was the knowledge that this building had never been his home, just temporary shelter he'd mistaken for permanence. Rebecca answered the door before James could knock, her face carrying exhaustion and something else, warmth maybe, or just relief that he'd actually shown up. "Thanks for coming. I made coffee." The interior smelled like baby powder and formula and cleaning products, the scent memory triggering associations with Kenneth's infancy that James thought he'd forgotten. Kenneth appeared in the hallway, Emily bundled in his arms, his expression complicated in ways James couldn't fully decode. Nervousness, certainly. Guilt, probably. Something else underneath that might have been hope. "You look thinner." Kenneth's observation was careful, clinical, the accountant's habit of noting discrepancies. "Lost about 20 pounds. Comes off easy when you're chopping wood every day." James kept his voice neutral, offering information without complaint, stating facts without seeking sympathy. Rebecca gestured toward the couch. "Sit, please. Kenneth let your father hold his granddaughter." The transfer happened with careful precision. Kenneth positioning Emily in James's arms, with instructions about supporting her head, watching for signs James didn't know what he was doing. But James did know. Muscle memory from 32 years ago, from Kenneth's infancy, from nights when Margaret slept and James walked circles around their small apartment trying to calm a colicky baby. His hands remembered the weight distribution, the gentle rocking motion, the way to hold an infant that communicated safety. Emily was 3 weeks old, eyes unfocused, face still carrying that undefined quality newborns had before their features settled into permanent configuration. She smelled like milk and clean laundry and something indefinably new. James looked down at her and thought about Margaret, about how she would have cried seeing this, would have filled albums with photographs, would have been the kind of grandmother who showed up unannounced with gifts and advice. Rebecca's voice came from the kitchen. "Would you like to visit regularly? Maybe Sunday dinners?" The offer hung in the air, weighted with implications. Regular visits meant acknowledging the situation, meant Kenneth and Rebecca accepting that James's life had diverged from normal parameters, but that connection was still possible. It meant James accepting help, accepting presence in their lives without the shame of having needed their space. "I'd like that, but I'm not moving back." James needed that boundary clear from the start, needed them to understand this wasn't negotiation toward his return. Kenneth's surprise was visible. "We weren't asking you to." "I know. Just making it clear." Rebecca brought coffee, and they sat in careful conversation discussing Emily's sleeping patterns and feeding schedule, avoiding topics that mattered. Kenneth showed James the nursery, the room that had been his bedroom, now painted yellow with a crib and changing table and shelves stacked with supplies. The transformation was complete, no trace remaining of the space James had occupied. He felt nothing looking at it, no resentment or loss, just acknowledgement that this had always been the inevitable outcome. After an hour, Kenneth followed James to the kitchen, creating space for private conversation. His hands fidgeted with a coffee mug, the nervous energy seeking outlet. "Dad, I was wrong. How I did it. I should have—" James interrupted. "You weren't wrong. You chose your family. That's what fathers do. But you're homeless. I made you. You gave me $200 for materials. Donald taught me survival skills. Stephen gave me work. I'm not homeless. I have a home. It's just not a house. Kenneth processed this, his face showing the effort of reconciling his assumptions with information that contradicted them. Are you really okay out there? I survived -54, built heating systems that work, earning more now than when I lived here. I'm not just okay, I'm building something. James paused, choosing words carefully. You gave me the push I needed. I'm not mad anymore. We're good. The words were true as James spoke them. The anger had burned away somewhere between the first storm and the second, replaced by understanding that came from surviving what he'd thought would kill him. Kenneth had made a choice that seemed cruel but was actually necessary, forcing James into a situation that revealed capabilities he'd forgotten he possessed. They agreed to Sunday dinners twice monthly. James would bring his skills help with household repairs, fix the electrical issues he could already see accumulating. Kenneth would contribute occasionally with groceries or materials James needed, framed as fair exchange rather than charity. The boundaries were clear. James's life in the Quonset, Kenneth's life in the house overlap, limited to Emily and mutual benefit. Driving back to the hut in Stephen's truck, James felt something shifting in his understanding of family. It wasn't the Hallmark card version where everything resolved into warmth and acceptance. It was more complicated, more honest. Kenneth would never fully understand why James had spent Margaret's treatment money, would never quite forgive the genetic legacy of potentially ending up in similar circumstances. James would never forget being told to leave, would never fully trust that welcome was unconditional. But they could coexist, could maintain connection through Emily, could offer each other practical value, if not emotional intimacy. The county inspector's car appeared at the hut on a Wednesday morning in early April, official seal on the door, clipboard in hand, expression suggesting he expected to find exactly the kind of disaster that justified condemnation. James had been splitting wood, his shirt soaked with sweat despite the 40-degree temperature, when the vehicle pulled up the access road. James Walker, the inspector's voice carried bureaucratic authority, received an anonymous complaint about this structure. Unauthorized dwelling, multiple code violations, safety hazards. I need to inspect the interior. James set down the axe carefully, keeping movement slow and non-threatening. I have documentation. Purchase receipt, lease agreement with the property owner, permission to occupy. Everything's legal. The inspector's skepticism was visible. Legal occupancy requires permits, inspections, compliance with residential codes. This is agricultural land zoned for storage structures, not habitation. The threat was clear. The county could condemn the hut, fine James, force evacuation. Everything he'd built over 16 weeks could disappear with a bureaucratic stroke. James calculated his options rapidly. Fighting would accomplish nothing. Cooperation might reveal the quality of his work, might demonstrate that despite unconventional circumstances, the structure met safety standards that mattered. Come inside. I'll show you everything. The inspection was thorough and hostile. The inspector clearly expecting to find fire hazards and structural failures that would justify his assumptions. James walked him through each system methodically. The rocket stove with proper venting and clearances, the electrical connections all done to code with materials rated for the applications, the carbon monoxide detector with fresh batteries and testing logs, the insulation layers creating proper R values and vapor barriers, the emergency exits and fire suppression equipment, the water filtration system and food storage protocols. The inspector tested outlets with a multimeter, checked the chimney installation, measured clearances, examined the structural integrity of the walls and roof. His expression shifted gradually from skepticism to surprise to something approaching respect. This is actually well built. The admission came reluctantly. Better than half the permitted structures I inspect. James pulled out the documentation binder he'd assembled, his electrical license from 35 years of industrial work, certifications for various specializations, detailed diagrams of every system, modification maintenance logs showing regular safety checks, photographs documenting the progressive improvements. The binder represented professional competence applied to unconventional circumstances, expertise that transcended the poverty of his situation. The inspector photographed everything, took extensive notes, then delivered his assessment. 0 violations. The zoning is borderline, but if you have the owner's permission and you're not operating a business from the property, I can classify this as seasonal dwelling. You'll need annual safety inspections at $50 per year, and you maintain these standards. But I can't condemn what meets code. Relief hit James like physical impact, but he kept his expression neutral. Who filed the complaint? Anonymous. But they claimed this was a death trap, imminent danger, should be demolished immediately. The inspector closed his notebook. Whoever filed it was either misinformed or deliberately lying. This is safe occupancy by any reasonable standard. James learned later, through Rebecca's tearful phone call, that her sister had filed the complaint concerned that Kenneth's professional reputation suffered from having a homeless father, worried that clients might judge him for family circumstances beyond his control. Rebecca had confronted her sister, cut contact completely, delivered an apology James hadn't sought but accepted because it mattered to her. Kenneth's call came that evening. "I'm sorry. Family shouldn't. I didn't know she'd do that." "Not your fault." James kept his response brief. "People judge. I'm used to it." "You passed inspection. That means something. It means I built something that works. That's all it ever meant." The county filed the paperwork officially classifying the hut as seasonal dwelling, legitimate occupancy, pending annual verification. James paid the $50 inspection fee and filed the certificate where he kept his important documents. The legitimacy felt strange, official recognition that his $8 metal box was legally his home, that survival could be formalized into bureaucratic approval. Stephen's call about the community college came 3 days later. Workforce Development Program needs an instructor for practical skills. 6-week course, 2 hours per week, starts this fall. $800 plus you keep any materials the students don't use. I gave them your name. They want to interview you next Tuesday, and the opportunity was obvious, terrifying, and inevitable. James had been teaching informally for weeks, transferring knowledge to people who needed it, proving he could communicate complex concepts in understandable terms. Formalizing that into paid instruction meant exposure, meant admitting publicly that his circumstances were permanent reality rather than temporary embarrassment. It meant using his situation as credential rather than hiding it as shame. Margaret's voice in his memory was clear. "You're a better teacher than you think. You just need to try." The interview happened in a sparse office, 3 committee members who'd clearly researched his background and were trying to reconcile his resume with his current living situation. James didn't hide anything. He explained Margaret's illness, the treatment costs, the financial collapse, the eviction, the $8 hut. He showed photographs of his systems, brought testimonials from people he'd helped, demonstrated the rocket stove principle using a model he'd built specifically for teaching purposes. The committee's questions were direct. Can you commit to consistent attendance? Will your living situation create transportation problems? Are you comfortable being public about your circumstances? James answered honestly. Yes to attendance, his truck ran reliably and fuel was budgeted. No to transportation problems. The college was 12 miles away. Yes to being public because hiding accomplished nothing. And his story might help someone else avoid similar catastrophe or survive it better if catastrophe was unavoidable. They offered him the position on the spot. 6-week curriculum, starting September. Topics negotiable but focused on practical survival skills for people facing economic hardship. Budget for materials, access to workshop facilities, opportunity to expand if enrollment justified it. James accepted immediately, then spent the drive back to the hut processing what had just happened. He'd gone from homeless man surviving in a metal hut to legitimate instructor at an accredited institution in 16 weeks. The transformation wasn't complete. His circumstances were still precarious, but the trajectory was undeniable. What had started as desperate survival was becoming something else, something that looked like purpose. The teaching accelerated through April and May. Word spread through channels. James couldn't track the homeless guy who knew electrical, who'd survived record cold, who would teach you survival skills for whatever you could afford to pay. The students arrived in steady flow, some desperate, some curious, all needing knowledge they'd never been taught. James developed curriculum as he went, learning what worked through trial and error. Rocket stove construction became a weekend course, students bringing materials and leaving with functional heating systems. Electrical basics filled weeknight sessions, safety and code compliance emphasized over shortcuts. Budget management and food preservation for people living on disability income. Mental resilience techniques for enduring circumstances that felt unendurable. The income stream from teaching matched his electrical work, $200 to $300 monthly in cash plus barter that was often more valuable than money. Firewood, food supplies, tools, materials he could use or trade. The exchanges built a network that functioned outside monetary economy, people helping each other because direct assistance was more efficient than converting everything to currency. One student started a handyman business using skills James taught. Another avoided eviction by winterizing a camper and living in it rent-free. A veteran with PTSD found structure in the routines. James emphasized the daily systems that created purpose when everything else felt meaningless. Each success reinforced James's understanding that knowledge mattered more than resources, that sharing what he'd learned multiplied its value beyond anything he could achieve keeping it private. Saturday mornings at Stephen's hardware store evolved into open consultation hours. James would arrive at 9:30, and people would queue informally, bringing questions about projects or problems or situations they didn't know how to navigate. He'd answer what he could, direct them to resources when he couldn't connect people with complementary skills. Stephen watched the pattern develop and finally formalized it. "You're running a consulting service from my coffee station. I'm charging you rent. 1 hour of electrical work monthly, keep my systems running." James accepted the terms. Fair exchange, mutual benefit, no charity involved. The VFW ceremony in late April was Donald's doing, a nomination James hadn't sought and actively resisted. Civilian Service Award for Community Impact, Resilience, and Veteran Support. The criteria fit, but James couldn't reconcile accepting military honors for surviving poverty and teaching people how to stay warm. Donald's counterargument was blunt. "You served this community, you earned recognition. Stop being stubborn and accept it." The ceremony attendance surprised James. 60-plus people in a town where he'd thought he was mostly invisible. Stephen spoke about the $8 investment that became a business model. 3 students gave testimonials about changed lives and learned skills. The county supervisor mentioned James's situation as proof that rural self-sufficiency programs could work if structured properly. The award was a plaque and a $500 grant for educational materials. James accepted, both uncomfortable with attention, but recognizing the political reality. Visibility created opportunities. Opportunities created resources. Resources multiplied impact. He'd learned to stop rejecting help when it arrived in forms he hadn't anticipated. The speech wasn't planned. The ceremony organizer pushed James to the podium expecting brief thanks. What came out was something else. "6 months ago, my son told me to leave his house. I thought my life was over." The room went silent, the statement too raw for polite gathering. "I was wrong. It was just changing." James paused, gathering thoughts he hadn't fully articulated even to himself. "I didn't survive that winter alone. Donald taught me. Stephen employed me. This community supported me by letting me earn my place." The words found rhythm, momentum building. If you're struggling, if you feel like you're not needed anymore, you are. Someone needs what you know. Someone needs your skills. Find them. Serve them. That's all I did. Found people who needed what I had. Gave it to them. The standing ovation felt wrong, excessive, but James accepted it as recognition of principle rather than personal achievement. What he'd proven was transferable adaptation mattered more than circumstances. Knowledge overcame resource scarcity. Community support could be earned through contribution rather than received through charity. The media coverage that followed was uncomfortable but useful. Local paper feature, regional news pickup, national blog. sharing his story with audience James would never meet. The exposure brought opportunities he had to carefully evaluate speaking engagements. He accepted when they paid interviews, he declined when they sensationalized consulting contracts, he negotiated to ensure fair compensation. The widow who owned the land contacted James in early May with an offer he hadn't expected. "I'm moving to assisted living. Would you buy the property? 5 acres includes the hut and everything on it. $8,000. James calculated his resources, $4,200 saved from teaching and electrical work. Income averaging $1,400 monthly, now credit established with Stevens Hardware Store. A bank loan for the remaining $3,800 was possible, payments of $150 monthly over 2 years, manageable on his current income with margin for fluctuation. The decision required considerations beyond pure mathematics. Buying meant committing to this location, this life, this identity as the guy who lived in the $8 hut and taught survival skills. It meant accepting that his trajectory wouldn't return to conventional housing, normal circumstances, the middle-class existence he'd had before Margaret's illness. It meant choosing this future deliberately instead of surviving it desperately. James negotiated terms: $4,200 down payment plan for the rest possession immediate. The widow accepted paperwork processed through an attorney who charged $200. James considered expensive but necessary. By mid-May, James owned 5 acres of rural land, a Quonset hut he'd purchased for $8 and transformed into functional dwelling, and the knowledge that this was genuinely his, that nobody could evict him or condemn it or take it away as long as he met his obligations. The long-term planning shifted immediately. James sketched designs for a permanent structure he could build next summer, something with proper foundation and insulation and windows that didn't leak. The Quonset would become workshop space, storage for tools and materials, shelter for students learning construction techniques. The land could support a practice tiny house demonstration projects, maybe eventually a teaching facility if enrollment justified expansion. Sunday dinners with Kenneth became reliable routine, twice monthly structure both families could depend on. James would arrive at 5, help with household projects until dinner, eat with Kenneth and Rebecca and Emily, leave by 8. The visits were cordial and functional relationship defined by practical exchange rather than emotional intimacy. Kenneth taught James basic accounting software for tracking his teaching business. James rewired Kenneth's garage and fixed the perpetually broken garbage disposal. They talked about Emily's development and weather patterns and local politics, avoiding topics that required vulnerability or honesty about their history. The relationship was good enough. Not what either of them might have wanted in ideal circumstances, but functional in the reality they actually inhabited. Emily provided neutral ground, shared investment that required cooperation without demanding reconciliation. Kenneth would never fully understand his father's choices. James would never fully forgive being told to leave. But they could maintain connection, could offer each other value, could coexist in the same family structure without pretending damage hadn't occurred. The summer teaching contracts arrived in June, 3 6-week courses through the community college, 40 students total, projected income of $15,000 before materials costs. Corporate consulting appeared from unexpected quarter. Rural development company wanted James's expertise designing low-cost housing systems for agricultural workers. The contract was 18 months, $5,000, developing prototype structures that could be replicated in multiple locations. The YouTube channel was Rebecca's suggestion. People would watch you build things. You explain concepts well. It could generate income and spread your methods wider than you can teach personally. James researched equipment costs, learning curve for video editing, time investment required. The mathematics suggested viability: initial investment of $800, potential monthly income of $200 to $500 if channel grew, time cost of 10 hours weekly. He started filming in July, documenting projects as he worked, explaining principles while demonstrating techniques. The production quality was amateur, but the content was authentic. Real problems solved in real time without editing out failures. By August, the channel had 3,000 subscribers, growing by 200 weekly. Comments came from people James would never meet, asking questions he could answer through video responses, sharing their own solutions and improvements. The knowledge multiplication was exponential. One person teaching hundreds who taught thousands. The network effect, transforming local impact into something approaching movement. The anniversary arrived without ceremony. 1 year since Kenneth had said, "We need to talk." Serious. 365 days from eviction to ownership, from desperation to purpose, from surviving to thriving in ways James still couldn't fully articulate. He marked the date in his journal with simple notation. Day 365, temperature 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Hard to remember being cold. James sat on the porch he'd built in April, drinking coffee as the sun rose over land that was genuinely his. The hut behind him was weatherproof now, insulated properly, systems optimized through months of testing and refinement. The property held stacked materials for the permanent structure he'd begin building next month. The teaching schedule extended through December with waiting list for January. The consulting contracts provided stability beyond disability income. Donald's truck appeared on the access road, the weekly check-in continuing despite James no longer needing rescue. They'd become something like friends, relationship built on mutual respect rather than obligation. Donald assessed the porch construction with professional eye. "You staying for next winter?" "Already planning improvements. Better insulation in the main structure, solar panels to reduce fuel dependency, maybe a greenhouse for extending food production season." Donald nodded approval. "You know you could afford actual house now." "This is a house. It's mine. I built it." James gestured at the property, the plans, the future he could see clearly now. "I'm not done. I'm just getting started." The statement was accurate in ways that went beyond building projects. At 58, James had discovered capabilities he'd thought were lost or had never existed. He'd proven that age wasn't endpoint, that rejection could become redirection, that poverty of resources could coexist with wealth of purpose. The $8 he'd spent hadn't bought shelter. It had bought opportunity to discover what he was actually made of when everything else was stripped away. Kenneth's text arrived mid-morning. "Emily's baptism next Sunday, 10 a.m. at St. Mary's. Would mean a lot if you came." James typed his response without hesitation. "I'll be there." The relationship would never be what it had been before Margaret died, before the money disappeared, before the eviction. But it was something connection maintained through deliberate choice, rather than obligation value exchanged in both directions. Understanding that family could be redefined into forms that worked even when they weren't perfect. James spent the afternoon teaching a young couple to build rocket stove in their garage hands, remembering the motions, words, finding the explanations that made complex principles accessible. The couple paid him $80 and left him 3 cases of canned goods worth $40 more. Fair exchange, mutual benefit. The economic model James had stumbled into through necessity and refined through experience. That evening he updated his journal with the final entry for year 1. "The hut still stands. I still stand. I thought being kicked out was the end. It was the beginning. My son didn't break me. The cold didn't break me. Poverty didn't break me. I learned what I was made of. Not steel, not will, but adaptation. At 58, I'm not done. Tomorrow finish student materials. Dinner with Kenneth and Emily at 6. Life continues. Better than before. The $8 wasn't for shelter. It was for a second chance. And I'm taking it." James closed the journal and filed it with the others' documentation of transformation he'd never planned but had executed anyway through daily choices that accumulated into trajectory. The past year had taught him that survival wasn't the achievement. The achievement was finding purpose within survival. Extracting meaning from circumstances that seemed designed to crush it, building something that mattered from materials everyone else had discarded as worthless. The sun set over his 5 acres, the hut casting long shadows across ground that would hold the foundation of something better next summer. James sat in the gathering darkness and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Anticipation for tomorrow, curiosity about what the next year would build, confidence that whatever came next, He had the skills and knowledge and community to handle it. Not because circumstances had improved, though they had, but because he'd changed in ways that made circumstances less deterministic. The cold couldn't kill him because he understood heat management. Poverty couldn't break him because he'd learned to create value without requiring capital. Isolation couldn't defeat him because he'd built networks through contribution rather than waiting for rescue. At 58, James Walker had become the person Margaret always believed he could be, not successful in conventional terms, but useful in ways that mattered, teaching others what he'd learned, turning survival into a system that could be replicated and improved. The $8 hut would always be the symbol, the physical proof that transformation was possible when you refused to surrender to circumstances. But the real achievement was invisible. The knowledge transferred, the lives changed, the community built from individual exchanges of value. That was the legacy Margaret would have recognized, would have celebrated, would have told him he should have found years earlier. James had needed catastrophe to discover it needed eviction and winter and near death to strip away everything except what actually mattered. He was grateful for all of it now. The pain, the cold, the fear, the failures. Not because they were good, but because they'd revealed capacities he'd never accessed during comfortable years. Comfort bred complacency. Catastrophe bred adaptation. James had adapted, and in adapting had found the purpose that made survival worth the effort required. The stars emerged one by one, the sky clearing as temperature dropped toward another cold night. But cold was just physics now, problem to solve rather than threat to fear. James went inside, fed the rocket stove, checked his systems with practiced efficiency, and settled into the routine that had kept him alive and would keep him building tomorrow and the day after and the year beyond that.